Hi, everyone. It's really good to be here with my old friend, Peter Adams.
Not so much to the old John.
Well, yes, I've known Pete since I was probably 7 years old when my parents moved from New Zealand, and Pete and Anne would have been two of the people we would have known way back then. And over the years, Peter has really been very formational, I think, in my life. He's been inspirational. He does work that is just brilliant. There's just not many other people doing what he would do. And so it's really good to be in your home patch, Luton town, and in St. Mary's Church of England Church, in front of this beautiful window. And so, Peter, do you want to just kind of introduce yourself, whatever titles you might have, and what you want to say about this church? And
I primarily do, Johnny, rather than have titles, but yes, I do have a few titles on the way. I work based here at St. Mary's, which is the sort of town centre parish church in Luton. Luton's a town of about 215,000 people, a very multicultural town, one of Britain's most multicultural towns. And I work here based at the church. I'm not a minister. I come from a background of working in peace building, reconciliation, as you know, community peace building, bits of which I most significantly learned with you in Northern Ireland around situations where you were. But I'm now living and working here in Luton, working with the church, helping the church engage with the issues of this very multicultural town, including a town where we've got quarter of our population are Muslim. And so based here at the church, but I always say I go out from the church. But in that, I also have a number of roles as sort of a senior layperson in the Church of England in Luton. I'm chair of the Church of England laity for the Diocese of St Albans.
Okay.
And I'm on the Church of England's General Synod, and we started a number of years ago a Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. So where you are now is our emerging Peace Chapel. Okay.
And tell us about that window then.
That window's themed on the Song of Mary, the Magnificat. And the artist who was leading stained glass artist of the mid-1900s, Alan Younger, said that he was inspired by the emotions that Mary had as she learnt that she would bear a son. As a virgin, an unmarried woman, she would bear a son who was to be the saviour of the world. And those emotions expressed in her song, the Song of Mary, the Magnificat. Stories of themes of justice and reconciliation, so much so that the Magnificat became a radical piece of literature. I mean, in Central America, it was banned in a number of nations. It was banned during the time of the fight for independence in India, because it's so much about bringing down the mighty and raising up the humble. So it was seen almost as an anthem of the disempowered.
Wow. And then some people listening to this would have heard of a guy called Shane Claiborne, who's been quite instrumental in trying to get guns, people handing in guns, which they then beat literally into farming tools. Taking that biblical phrase, you'll beat your swords into ploughshares. And you've got a little kind of sculpture piece of art here that came through. Shane got involved in that and using decommissioned
Shane was here in England doing a tour last year with Red Letter Christians, with Tony Campolo, and we wanted to take that theme of swords into ploughshares, radical peacemaking, turning instruments of violence and war into something of peace. And so we worked with Bedfordshire Police, our local police force. We collected about 2,000 knives from their knife amnesty bins. And one of our members, Luke, who you met earlier, turned with another member, created this knife phoenix from about 200 knives, including some serious weapons, swords and fighting knives and so on. A lot of domestic knives as well. And it's a symbol of how something that's ugly and used for violence and used for killing can be turned into something of beauty. So we a phoenix rising from the ashes of violence and destruction with new life as a very strong Christian metaphor for peace, but a metaphor for peace that everybody gets, because those words, turning swords into ploughshares, are right outside the United Nations building in New York, for example.
Yeah. So Luton, a lot of people listening may not know too much about Luton. I recommend a movie I saw on the airplane last week, Blinded by the Light, which is an unlikely story of a young Pakistani immigrant boy growing up in 1980s Luton and his obsession with Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant capture of many things, of immigration, of England in the 1980s, of the challenge of being an immigrant. Tell us a bit about Luton, Peter, and you touched on a few things, a bit of the size, a large Muslim population. Also, it's known with a large far-right tendencies as well.
Lots of things to go there. Yeah, just before I forget it, Blinded by the Light was actually, two of the scenes were actually filmed here in the church.
Oh, wow,
one in the church, one outside the church. So the sort of romance scene is just outside with, that was filmed back in 2018.
Okay. Yeah.
And we love it.
Yeah.
So it's the story, as you say, of a young person growing up in a very multicultural town where increasingly his own community are very strong and growing. Sarfraz Mansour, who is the author and the scriptwriter for that, grew up in the town. And his is the story of, just in many ways, like Springsteen, coming to terms with who he was in his hometown, which is a bit of a dump. It's the sort of place that people, legend says, try and escape from. So one of the key points in there is him leaving Luton. And actually, that's an unresolved piece for us. I mean, some would say the film doesn't do Luton well, but actually, it's a town we love. I'd like to call it a workshop for peace. It's a place where we are actively having to engage with the themes of what it means to make peace in a community. We can't take that for granted. We've all the time got to be negotiating, working through how we live together with people who are very different. And for me as a Christian, that's precisely what I'm called to. And so that's why we've set up this Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. It's really the attempt by the church to enable the church in Luton and beyond to live comfortably in this very multicultural, postmodern, post-Christian world where other faiths are very strong and have a part, but where actually I think if we take the biblical story rightly, we're called to live together despite our difference. I can hold on to my faith as a Christian. I'm passionate in my faith as a Christian. And yet do that humbly and gently. All the time, as Peter calls us, being prepared to give account for my faith, and yet doing so gently and with reverence and honour to those who are different. Yeah. So, some of my best friends in this town are people of other faiths, and particularly Muslims who I count as very dear friends, who I can share very deeply with and work very closely with in a relationship of trust. And that's something that we're trying to help others do. Because I think that's the future. It's the future of the world. It's the future of Britain. We need to learn to do that. Live with our differences. Yeah,
and we were going to actually, this podcast originally was going to be a conversation with you and a colleague of yours, a Muslim lady activist in the town, but unfortunately she wasn't able to make it. And so, but this gives us the opportunity really to dig into your work, which is a good opportunity anyway. But I suppose, one of the far right groups was the English Defence League, has made the news over here quite a bit in the last decade, probably. Is your role at times literally being kind of standing out on the streets, kind of between people? I mean, what is that?
Okay, so I suppose a little background there, going back to some of the things you mentioned earlier. We are a very multicultural town. A quarter of our people in 2011 were Muslim. We're a very poor town. We're also surrounded by very wealthy Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire home counties, commuter territory. So, you go from here to Harpen, which you know well, and I know well, your average lifespan will increase by 10, 12 years. Your wealth goes up. Zoom. The colour of the population there is white. Here it's every colour under the sun. And we have that strong Muslim population, and amongst them there have been a number of extremists. So when 9/11 took place, there were those who shouted joyously, but they were already people who were on the margins of the Muslim community. And over the years, particularly after the London bombings in 2005, they were increasingly marginalised. And they don't play any significant part in the public life of the Muslim community here. Any space they create is their own. There's a few of them. They were on the streets. They're now not on the streets nearly as much. But in response to that, in 2009, there was the defining moment in Luton's story was on March 10th, 2009, and there was a homecoming parade of a local regiment that recruited from Luton and others that coming back from Iraq, and several members of that regiment had died on that tour, including a Luton lad. So when they were doing their homecoming parade through Luton, about 14, 20 of these guys were on the streets with signs that sort of really just lambasted the Muslim guys, the soldiers.
And it is lambasted the soldiers.
Ugly signs condemning them, rapists and killers and so on,
war criminals.
And there were about 5,000 Lutonians just welcoming them home, and it got ugly, and it was very clear there was an orchestrated sort of response from a far right grouping that sort of really struck out at these guys and cornered them, and the police, they would have killed them, I think, if the police hadn't eventually managed to contain the crowd. I was there watching this, and for me, it was what's going on in the town, and I went home and literally got to grips with trying to understand what this was. And out of that fledgling group that opposed those Muslim extremists at the time emerged a group that later became called the English Defence League. Stephen Lennon, Tommy Robinson, resident of this town, grown up in the town, was their leader. And he has become a public figure now for extremist, representing sort of far-right voice, always in the media. Well, he was until the media sort of marginalised him, social media banned him and so on. But always there, stirring up trouble. He doesn't live in the town any longer, he lives nearby. But he occasionally comes in still stirring up trouble. But he makes trouble around the world, frankly. And out of that emerged a sort of reputation for us. So over the years following that, we had quite a few demos. We lived with these guys as local people who were all the time rabble-rousing around local issues. But then there were occasions when they would bring in thousands to demonstrate. And that really unsettled the community, because what those demos do, because, I mean, the police, I suppose, rightly, say freedom of speech, they've got a voice, they've got a right to express their voice. Well, yes, they have, but actually what happens is the town gets filled with that sort of poisonous atmosphere of hate. And so we've had a town where over the years hatred has been so openly expressed on many occasions. It's unsettled us, and we've had to get in there, and I worked with the church leaders and with the Muslim community, with the police and others to actually, as you say, get in between groups. And so when our big demonstrations have happened on one point we had 75, 80 Christian leaders in the town out on the streets, just doing anything that makes for peace, standing between groups, out there just calming fears, talking to people who were confused, creating a place of refuge for people who were upset and needed, in case anything got really bad, working with the police, just really trying to make sure that the town could return to normal afterwards. And that's been a work I've led, really, and it's been a joy to lead it.
Yeah. I mean, without kind of overly repeating myself, I kind of have to say this almost in most podcasts, but the podcast series is called Guardians of the Flame, which is about our attempt to amplify voices that bring beauty through the message of Jesus. and through other faith voices, finding voices of construction, of peace, of reconciliation in the midst of religious belief. And obviously, we're seeing, I think, around the world a growth in what has been called populism, nativism, a kind of our country first, Britain first, America first. And so you're really living in a very much, it feels like a ground zero kind of space with radical elements on both sides, far right, English Defence League, and in the past, you've had some radical Islamic voices as well. I remember hearing Steve Chalk, who's founder of the Oasis Trust in London, and he said something very interesting. He was talking about a government policy, I think called Prevent. I think that's what it was called. But he basically said its aim is de-radicalization. And he said that's basically that's the most foolish thing you could ever do. You can't de-radicalize a young person. By definition, a young person desires to be radical. Desires to kind of make a difference, do something. And this kind of policy he saw, it was self-defeating. What should have been happening was a funneling of passion and energy into something good. What's your takeaway in terms of working with radical elements?
We can talk about that and probably need to, but let me tell you a story about the ugliness of conflict turned into beauty. Because I think that is symbolic for our whole journey here. I mentioned English Defence League, but there are other far-right groups. One, Britain First, which I think they've had quite an involvement over in Northern Ireland, because
we've been graced with their presence.
Yeah, you have, and Paul spent a lot of time there at one point in his life. Paul Golding, one of the leaders. They came here on a number of occasions, 2014, 15, 16. And we worked extensively to actually, because they claim more of a Christian voice. It's very marginal. It's perhaps a little bit more at home in your community, but it's very marginal here. But we wrote to them as church leaders and said, we don't need you when they here working for us in this town. That was when they planned to come for a demo in 2015. They did, they came. We actually met with them for 3 hours before the meeting, before the demo, a few days before. Myself, one of our vicar of the church here, and one of the black leaders in the town, just met with them and said, please don't come. We talked and talked about their own faith and so on, and there seemed to be a genuine testimony there. And they came and we lived through that, and it was in early January 2016, they came, about 30 of them, carrying 2-foot crosses in sort of paramilitary uniform. They've been learning their lessons from over your part of the world. And they marched through Bury Park, which is where the majority of the Muslim community is centred, with their crosses. And, of course, they attracted a lot of anger. But they went over, the deputy leader, Jada Franson, went over and really verbally assaulted a young Muslim woman with her children. It was ugly. They wound her up and she got cross with them. But you see that on the video. You don't see the 15 minutes that actually CCTV captured of their dialogue before the bit they captured. And we heard about this, and one of my principles is I try and get in there as soon as possible after there's been a point of conflict. So the next day we were in Bury Park with about 20 of us as Christian leaders after church on Sunday with carnations, with a message of peace. We shared that around and we met this young woman and just shared the message and shared some flowers with her, as indeed with shopkeepers and all. And it was so well received.
And the message would have been...
just, this does not represent us. 6 months later, July 2016, a Catholic priest had been murdered by a Muslim extremist over in Rouen in France. And that Sunday, a group of 25 Muslim leaders and others came to several of the churches in the town, the main Catholic church, to us. And I looked at that group, I welcomed them at the door, we knew they were coming. They came with flowers and a message. because they wanted to say, they were returning that gesture of friendship. And I looked at this group, and there was this young woman, Samaya, and I hadn't seen her until then. She looked at me and she said, "Yes, Peter, it's me." And she later said to me, she stood on the platform and shared the message. She wasn't the key leader of that group. She came with Rahana, my friend, who you'd hopefully meet sometime. And she said, as they shared the message, she said, "I was free. I was free of the anger. I was free of the trauma. I was free of the desire for revenge." That's de-radicalization, Johnny. And actually it's about relationship. It's about extending love and friendship. Getting in there and meeting somebody in their trauma, in their anger that can be stirred up so often by extremists, and the dialogue, the message of extremists worms its way out. But Rahana came alongside her with friendship and built on the friendship we'd offered. And Samaya is now working for peace. And we've got other stories like that as well.
So it's not so much a kind of a negative de-radicalization. It's a steering the kind of the anger. Maybe sometimes there can be a healthy anger.
Yeah.
Anger at racism, anger at discrimination, steering that in a generation that builds bridges and relationships.
Our story, your story, my story, we will have moments of trauma. I've been through lots. And actually the thing is, the thing I think is so important in those moments is to allow God through his people as Christians, find models, methods of calming ourselves and not allowing our lives to be marked by that trauma and that anger and that pain, but allowing ourselves to resettle and find peace. And that can come through all sorts of ways, but it often will come through friendship. And at that point, that's the point where but you become a radical for peace rather than a radical for anger and hatred and destruction. And at the heart of the government's policy it's very superficial. It doesn't take faith seriously because it sees faith as the problem. And we as church leaders have said we couldn't live with this because actually this model sees faith as a problem. It encourages faith leaders to get in there and work with young people and almost then report them. And we can't allow that to happen. We have to come alongside people and walk with them in their pain and their journeys. Pastorally. I always say my work of de-radicalization, whether it's on the far right or with Muslims, is about friendship. It's about sharing love. And it's about reaching out to them in that pain and walking with them in that journey.
Kind of as we're talking through issues, and I suppose some people listening to this wouldn't necessarily have faith. Probably, I would imagine I've got no way of knowing what my...
Who are you out there?
Who these millions are that watch.
Johnny wants to know. You write in and tell him.
Leave a review on iTunes. No. But I suppose a lot of people listen to this would be from a faith background, and particularly a Christian background. Yeah. And I think in my life I have seen is that Christians, I speak from my tradition, my tribe, Christians don't really know the place of reconciliation. And particularly when it comes to a growing pluralistic societies in the West, multicultural cities, Christians haven't often got a theology of what it would mean to be a reconciler. And so you see a Muslim over there and you think, well, my first job is to convert them. And of course, because of all of that they may be going through, that can come across in a very negative way. And how do you balance your kind of strong Christian commitment, which is not some woolly kind of, kind of, you're one of the most passionate people I know in your faith. How do you kind of balance that? Yeah, I guess we can go into then, where does your theology of reconciliation, where is it shaped by?
How do I balance it? I'm unapologetically Christian. And unapologetically Christian has opened doors for me amongst the leadership of the Muslim community here in Luton, with the police, in the town halls, local government, with other groups. I've never seen my faith exclude me. You know, I always say I think Christians can be persecuted for two things. One for their faith and one for being jerks. And actually too often we're persecuted because we're just not nice people. And actually, somebody said to me last year, your faith just oozes out of you, Peter. Your love just oozes out of you. And that was a huge compliment, because actually I want to be nice, but I don't want to be soft, nice. But actually, I think, you know, the fruits of the Spirit they talk about a person who you can engage with, you can sit down and talk to about anything, who creates a safe space for you. And actually, for me, reconciliation and peacemaking is actually creating that safe space. Early in my days in walking in this, in call to become a peacemaker, I used to use the phrase "a place of grace," and I think we just need to define where we are by grace and niceness and kindness and the goodness of God, because I find in that place of grace where my demeanour, where my attitude, shaped by God's power, allows me to be nice and decent and respectful and honouring of others. And with that accompanied by something of God's grace and goodness coming into that space, you can have all manner of conversations around difference, around sexuality, around faith, around all the things that divide you as a community. And so basically my role in this town is to create places of grace, safe spaces where people can talk about anything, really. And that's why if you have a conversation sometime with myself and Rahana, you will, I hope, find a space where we can talk about anything. And we do. And it's important for the peace of our town that we can talk about anything. And I'm just trying to multiply that, really.
Wow. And what would be some of your key kind of texts in Scripture where you kind of have felt this is what it says here, you know, this is the space of grace is right there, you know?
I suppose really one of the most important for me is the words of Jesus, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God, children of God." I was walking around during a time of worship once, as I do. I never sit still, I always pace. And I found myself looking, I'd been reflecting on that scripture in Matthew 5. And then I found myself looking at kids and their parents and their grandparents and thinking, oh, the family image. And then suddenly it hit me. When I'm a peacemaker, people see the image of God in me. And I'm seen as a child of God. Now, different people, and I think even on your own podcast, different people have talked about the scripture and had different ways of seeing it, and they're all legitimate. But for me, it's when people see the image of God. And I think the story. You were involved yourself in the reconciliation walk, where as a church, large numbers of Christians from the Anglo-Saxon world, really, and the European world, went to the Holy Land and across the routes of the Crusades and shared a message of reconciliation and apology for the Crusades. I always remember right at the end of that, we were over in Gaza, sitting down with a leader of a radical Islamic group that we had been asked if we would meet with. And these angry men who carried etched in their faces generations of anger. We shared that message, and the leader looked at me and said, "Truly, you're a son of God." And then I looked mystified, and he said it again. And he said, "The trouble with you Christians is you don't believe the words of Jesus, do you? Didn't Jesus say, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. He saw the image of God in us.
As you shared.
Because we were doing a God thing of making peace.
Yeah, it was the 900th anniversary of the,
That's right.
of the First Crusade.
That was 1999.
And and the message was simply, we're sorry, basically.
Yeah.
You know.
And I've experienced a number of occasions like that where my humility and my actively creating that space of grace allowed, we had an hour of dialogue after that, and they said all sorts of stuff that I could have become very defensive about, but we didn't, because we'd humbled ourselves. We couldn't fight back. But that place, it wasn't painful, because that place it was like it was surrounded by cotton wool. All the anger and the pain was absorbed by God's grace. And I think for me, that was a defining moment in my call to be a peacemaker, because I went away from that time and saying, what if I could build on that encounter? Now, in that situation, I wasn't ready, I wasn't prepared, we didn't have the tools, we didn't have the relationships to do that. But I sought to create safe spaces, places of grace here where we can continually work and build. Yeah.
So, you kind of do this full time. I suppose a lot of people listening might have day jobs in other ways, Do you have any kind of experience or stories of where you've been able to see people, kind of normal people, take steps in creating spaces of grace, What would it look like for someone to do that?
Well, actually, I'll tell you a story of me when I was 23. When I was just a young guy, deputy manager of a hostel for overseas students in South London. Just when I say deputy manager, we were getting a house for free, a flat for free, living there. And I had to do duty a couple of days a week. Next door neighbour was a lovely guy, Jordanian, he told me. He was actually Palestinian. And his day when he didn't have to go into college until midday was one of the days I served. So we'd often have coffee and play pool together. And I was waxing eloquent, getting excited about Israel at the time, and at one point in conversation, not really aware of what this was doing to him.
That was your theological bent at the time.
Yes, at that point, yeah.
End times,
a little bit. Not too much the end times, but Israel, still strong in Israel.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he said, Peter, let me tell you a story. He began to tell me about what it was like to grow up in the refugee camps of Gaza. I thought of him all those years later. Having father who died of this, and mother who was sick with this, and siblings who died of that, and so on, and friends who died of this, and all the pain. And it just challenged everything I knew and thought. I didn't have any answers. And I never really thought much about it, but a couple of weeks later, he came and knocked on the door when I was on duty and said, I'm leaving. And he was paid up. He paid a month's rent ahead and he left. I met his friends as he was leaving. It was 3 or 4 weeks after that, a knock on the door. A couple of guys stood there and they were plainclothes special branch police officers. Showed me their ID, said, do you know this guy? Showed me a picture. I said, oh, that's Marwan al-Banna. Marwan had gone and he'd been one of the 4 who attempted the assassination of the Israeli ambassador in 1982 in London. Now, that was the cause of the Lebanon War. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, because the day or two after, Israel went into southern Lebanon. And so it sort of unsettled everything, and so it went on from there. And I know you've got lots of experience of Lebanon. And actually, I often think back to myself, and I really realised this after going to Gaza, and particularly then after 9/11. What if I, as a 23-year-old, just finished student, could have met his words of pain with a place of grace? Just allowing him to talk, to meet my humility as a Christian. Could he have been de-radicalised at that point? Now, I wasn't a Christian leader full-time working in reconciliation. I was Peter, a 23-year-old. And it was one of those looking back, it was a what-if moment.
So if we could all kind of maybe see in our own lives these moments where we can have a vocation to create spaces of grace.
And how many times, I thought to myself after that, how many times have I sat on planes, sat in restaurants, how many times could I have reached out just to people I didn't even know and created that sort of space? Actually, that story, it was in 1996, the Israelis shelled a UN command post in southern Lebanon, 100 people killed. On that day, a young Egyptian wrote down that he would give his life to take the Zionists, oppressors, and their American allies. It was like a living will. He went on to lead the gang that led 9/11.
Wow.
So I think, what if I, 23-year-old, could have done something that could have helped Marwan? Israel, the story of Lebanon might well have been different. 9/11 could have been different. That's an ordinary person.
Yeah.
And it's a what if.
Yeah.
And I don't say I'm this big guy doing all this big stuff.
Yeah.
Actually, that's an ordinary person. And how many of the people listening to this podcast could do something, and you never know who it would be?
That's it's you're touching on something there about maybe sometimes the root of radicalization, which is often some kind of trauma. And I know that's been a passion of your own life, is kind of looking at dealing with helping people with trauma and realizing that is often part of our solution, is not just kind of dealing with symptoms out there, but looking deeper.
Yeah, trauma. I think we're really only just beginning to understand trauma and PTSD, post-traumatic stress, and how you manage PTSD and so on. I mean, I've been just recently doing a lot of work with victims, survivors of sexual abuse in the church. And I mean, just yesterday I was with some survivors, and the trauma and the impact of that trauma from that story is just so deep in their lives. But it's the same sort of trauma that comes from those who've experienced all sorts of stuff. And that's the root on which ideology can grab you. And ideology and trauma wrapped up together empower your story and make you a very angry person who can do all sorts of stuff. But when that trauma is reached out to and healing, it can be settled, and it can. But people, I remember sitting down, and I've sat down on a number of occasions. I mean, my style is, very early on in our engagement with the far right, as it broke out here in Luton, was to try and understand them and hear their stories, actually hear their trauma. And I sat down on one occasion talking to Stephen Lennon, the former founder of the EDL, and heard his stories. He tells his stories on video, in his book and all sorts of places. Some of them true, but it's the spin he puts around them. And they're the stories of somebody growing up in a multicultural town and the pain of that. And our parishioners here, and the people who went out on the early EDL demos here. I just began, as I began to try and understand that movement, I would follow them on Facebook. Not follow them on Facebook, I would look at the public events on Facebook, look at the dialogue. And I was amazed how many people I knew who I saw there who were friends of mine, as Facebook tells you that. And I thought, who are these people? How are they my friends? That was quite scary. But actually they were people who were friends of a church leader in another church, or they were children of people in another church who I knew. And actually I got the opportunity to sit down with them and understand them and talk to them. Stephen Lennon's uncle, Darren, was somebody who I met first when he shouted me down and intimidated me out of a meeting. He was one of the founders of the English Defence League. But he gradually began to engage with me, and he's now totally changed.
Wow.
He's working against extremism.
Wow.
Because we reached out, and I didn't respond to the emails, anonymous emails of hate. And I reached out to him on the street, and then I sat down and had a cup of tea with him, and that grew and grew and grew. And then he took a Muslim friend of mine to a football match at Luton Town. And that was a big statement for him. He's not a person of faith. Darren has no real faith. He for him, football's Luton Town is his thing. And taking Muslim there was so much a healing piece in his story.
Yeah. And so for you, I think what you're saying is that you see that a story like that is beautifully Christian. That's beautifully what Jesus would do.
But he's not really responding from a place of faith. He's just responding from goodness.
But a lot of that, the ground has been prepared by people like yourself who are going, actually, this is what our calling is to do, is to create a space for grace, a space for change. Obviously, theologically, you and I both know from our background, many young Christians, speak about our own group, we are often very interested in just purchasing fire insurance, like it's the afterlife. It's how do we make sure we go to heaven when we die? And there doesn't seem to be much relevance to this earth, let your kingdom come on earth. It's all about, may I get to eternal bliss now. So, what you're doing is you're actually creating space here on earth, which I think is really important. Now, you talked about the stained glass window, and which kind of references the Magnificat, and I think it was you mentioned the Magnificat was it banned
it was banned in some of the nations of Central America.
Because it was seen as
so radical.
Mary said, "You bring down the lofty, the high, the powerful." And we. Obviously, without getting, I don't mind getting a bit political, but obviously we live in an age where, for instance, in North America, there's been 81% of those of evangelicals that voted for Trump. And, without kind of saying that's good or bad, very obviously, a lot of what was behind that was this sense that we need to get a guy who's going to have our side in the White House. We need to be powerful, almost inversely of Mary's song, which was about weakness. And of course, and now that's spreading. You've got Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's well known. He's been embraced by the evangelical church and Pentecostals in Brazil as their kind of darling, and yet it seems quite questionable. And we have a history of that, of kind of allying ourselves to powerful leaders because we think that somehow is going to do good. What do you have to say about that kind of environment where people of faith are, instead of guarding a fame of humility and grace and enemy love, we are promoting our, interests. We see sometimes a victim mentality. Everyone's out to get us. Persecution complex.
Hey, look around you. We see here the product of 900 years of the power of the church in this land. I work, this is the parish church Luton. It was the church in Luton. Grave over there, tablet tells of how the church member there had a spat with a Baptist in the town back in the 1700s. We celebrated that sort of stuff. We were the powerful church. We controlled the population. We did power. White Anglo-Saxon male privilege was us. I work out of this place. But actually, we know that the Church of England here in this nation can't be defined by that any longer. Yeah, we've got all of that, but actually, and we are still part of the establishment. And I sit in the chamber of the governance body of the Church of England as a member of the Church of England General Synod, and I laugh at all the legislative stuff that we do and the way we have to do it in order to be the established church. But actually it's a part of our legacy. But for so many out there, it means nothing. You know, our bishops, some of them sit in the House of Lords. They do incredible stuff. I mean, my own Bishop Alan has done some incredible work on opposing the gambling industry. He's a consistent voice for justice and righteousness in the chamber of the House of Lords. Yet others would question why are these bishops in the Lords? They're actually probably the most effective opposition at the moment, frankly, and voice for justice. Yet, yes, why are they there? They're there because of history. They're there because of power. I know all about power, but when I go out from here, does that power mean anything in the town? We are the traditional civic church of Luton. We used to have a service for the mayor every year, etc., etc., etc. You know, what does that look like now in this post-Christian world? What's it look like in this multicultural town where the Church of England means nothing to so many? Actually, what it means is that we as Christians, we as the Church of England, and I think we as Christians more generally, to answer your question, can be there for the oppressed, can be there for the powerless, can be there for those who suffer, can be there for the poor, can be there for the prisoners, can be there for the hungry, can be there for those who are refugees, can be there for those who are powerless. It means giving of ourselves, giving of our legacy, prophetically, and saying you matter because you are a child of God, not because you're like me, a Christian, but you're a child of God, made by God in his image, and you are beautiful, and you mean something, and you're valuable. That's the basis on which I work and which we carry. That's the basis on which we're trying to reimagine what it means to be civic church. Reimagine what it means to be the powerful church, the establishment church here in Luton. And I think I would say that to all those who stand with Mr. Trump, Bolsonaro, or whoever. Actually, okay, so they may be trying to cozy up to you. I'm not going to say that's right or wrong. I'm not going to challenge their faith. That's up to them and God. But what I will do is say, are you abandoning your root calling, which is to stand for all and to stand with the powerless and to seek justice and righteousness in our world and seek peace? Or are you just going to seek your own privilege?
Yeah. Maybe we'll bring this to a close with maybe just the last couple of questions. And I suppose I thought I wasn't going to do it, and then I thought, actually, well, you know, we should get into political stuff in a sense. We're not necessarily roll around in the dirt, but of politics. But there are issues that really are important to the world.
Yeah.
And of course, in this part of the world, Brexit has dominated the news for the last 4 years in a way that none of us ever would have imagined. Obviously, for us in Northern Ireland, it's had massive consequences, and there's still a great deal of insecurity about what it's going to mean. But of course, it appears like it has kind of happened. You know, there's this kind of year of transition, and I could talk endlessly about my frustration with it and sadness and grief and hope that it will change. But at the same time, there is a clarifying moment in that it has happened. And I suppose you're not in Northern Ireland, you're here in England, south of England. What do you think, how do you respond in a post-Brexit world now, or post-Brexit England? You know, for the last few years, I know a lot of my energy has been kind of bemoaning it and protesting it, and but there's not much point in that in a sense anymore. I mean, there's a certain point you don't need to give up, but we have to kind of somehow begin to create something out of the ashes in some ways, not to be overly dramatic. And not everyone, obviously it's a polarizing issue, and not everyone's going to agree with me watching this, but how do we be a creative force in the midst of something that we find deeply displeasurable and painful?
To be honest, we go on and do what we always do. I mean, I'm the same person doing the same message as I had before, creating a place where people can talk about these issues. And yes, if I draw attention to the issues that come because of Brexit now, it's not because I oppose Brexit. I did. But it's because I'm drawing attention to the fact that a consequence of Brexit is this, that this person has lost their passport, that this person has lost a job, or whatever it might be. And we're not really there yet, but I anticipate we will be. And in Northern Ireland, a lot more. And we need to draw attention to those things. And create spaces to talk about it. Actually, as you say, it's not the issue any longer. We're living in that world, but we're still faced by the consequences. What does deeply challenge me is the way that lies and untruths and manipulation were used in the political campaigning, and were done so, by both sides, but I think particularly the Leave side. The use of social media to multiply untruthful news stories.
Like the one of the woman who was confronted by the Britain First Lady, that kind of a confrontation where a Muslim woman was victimized, was treated badly.
That video of her abuse, well, before it was taken down, went out 50 million times on just YouTube. Yeah. It was many, many more than that.
And I saw Americans sharing that.
Our own video of us doing flowers got 128,000, which was pretty good going, but nowhere near. Yeah. But actually, I've seen that story come up. Of the young Muslim woman shouting back at the leader of Britain First, carrying her cross. I've seen that. I've seen the picture of Stacey Dooley being confronted by Anjem Choudary, the radical Muslim leader here in Luton. I get sent it by friends, mainly from America, many times every year, saying, "You're living in Luton, what's this about?" Yeah. And actually, I said, I was there. This is what happened on that day. This is why Stacey was abused by Anjem. Anjem doesn't live in Luton. Anjem has a few followers in Luton, etc. Let's hear the truth around these stories. We've got to unpack those lies, but recognise the reality is the political thing has been done. Reach out to Europe. Reach out to those who are Britons in Europe. Reach out to Europeans who are married here. There's so many things we've got to do to keep this a society where actually God's standards of justice and peace continue to be upheld, or at least spoken out by some.
And finally, we've been touching on this for really our whole interview, but I remember a sociologist from the States refer to the phenomenon of demographic anxiety, and the sense that, and I heard a general in the United States Army last week use exactly the same phrase. The phrase was, there's a sense in which in America, white people have been standing in line for their turn. Yeah. And suddenly a bunch of immigrants have cut in front of them, or a bunch of people of color, of black people, whatever, And there's a sense of injustice. It was our turn. And I think a black president fueled that in America, this sense of, hey, the black president, and now all these immigrants are coming in, and then there's this anxiety of living in a town, and this general I was talking to last week, a very pleasant guy, but basically said the same thing. He didn't know anything about my politics. He just goes, but this country's hard, Johnny, because my mom was an immigrant here, and we were standing in line, and then these people have cut in. He used exactly the same phrase I'd heard a sociologist use 2 years earlier. So in a lot of Western countries, there's demographic anxiety.
Huge.
They look different.
It's part of the rhetoric of the far right.
Yeah.
It's one of their key narratives.
Yeah. So what do we do to say it's okay, they're not coming to steal your jobs? I mean, obviously that's a political argument, but Is there something we can start to do that's constructive?
Well, I mean, I do occasionally point people back to history. Well, they're here because we went there.
Yeah.
We as Britain did lots of stuff on the Indian subcontinent for many years before they came here, and it was destructive of many millions of lives. That is a reality. That's a fact. It's probably not a very helpful one to draw attention to. But the fact is that they were here by our invitation. They're here doing jobs because we invited them to come do jobs post-war when the economy was down and we needed to build. That's why we have people from all of the nations of the Commonwealth here. That's why the Irish are here in large numbers in Luton. Bless them. It's why everybody's here, because there were jobs and we needed people to do the work. And now we've got lots of Eastern Europeans and we still need people to do the work. Because, so actually, yes, there's a lot of issues, and there is anxiety, and there are real stories of injustice towards white people, but there are huge stories of injustice towards people of other colour and people of other ethnic background. And actually, my place as a peacemaker is to try and make a place where actually we, and as church, I come back to that's what we're called to be, a place in the centre of Luton where actually people with their anxieties can come, with their traumas, all those negative stories, can come and find peace. And where actually, if you come into the church, you will see at our entrance door, live at peace with all. Etched in the glass doors at the entrance. We as a church celebrate together at the Eucharist, at the Holy Communion, where we come as one before the table of the Lord. We make peace with God through Jesus, and we find peace with one another. We share the peace as part of our service. We share the peace together. An opportunity to even deal with some of the things that could be wrong in our relationships. I will often challenge myself. Is there anybody here in the church I need to commit to during this time of making peace, to sit down and arrange a coffee with them later in the week and just put right something? So we come together as the people of God from all the tribes of Luton. We are a very multicultural church. And we live together in peace as a Christian community. When you go out from here, the other glass door says live at peace with all. Same challenge. So it's commissioning us to go out and live as people of peace in this town. Now, I didn't make the decision to put that door in. It was put in about 2 years before we moved here. But for me, it said, that's what this place is. It's the place in this community that enables people to come in, talk their stories, come to a place of understanding, come to a place of healing, come to a place of real unity together, and then to walk out as people of light, people living that peace out in the town. So when I go out as a peacemaker, taking that peace to everybody in this town.
Brilliant. Well, Peter, thanks so much for your time. I think, the mayor here, and you've received, the mayor has given you an award of outstanding citizen. You've received other awards.
That's right.
And I think in our conversation, I can see why, and I hope people watching, people listening, can see why. Thanks for the work that you're doing. I think you're a beautiful model of what it can look like to be a citizen, take citizenship seriously. On earth, but also in that sense of a citizen of heaven, where an ultimate allegiance is to one who calls us to be at peace with all.
Absolutely.
And so thanks for your work and your friendship over many years, and and thanks for inviting us to Luton. And
thank you, Johnny. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, good to have you. Okay.